Imagine waking up in absolute darkness. Not the familiar darkness of your bedroom at night, but a darkness so complete, so utterly devoid of light, that your eyes cannot adjust no matter how long you wait. The air is thick and stale, pressing against your skin like a cold, damp blanket. You try to move, and your hand brushes against something hard and smooth. As your fingers explore, the shape becomes unmistakably clear. It's a bone, a human bone, and scattered all around you there are hundreds more. This was the reality for 7 men in the year 447 AD, somewhere in the hills near Ephesus, in what we now call Turkey. They awoke in a sealed cave, confused and terrified, with no memory of how they came to be there. The last thing they remembered was falling asleep the previous night, hiding from religious persecution in their city. But when they finally clawed their way out of that suffocating darkness and emerged into daylight, the world they found was not the world they had left behind. The city had changed. The buildings looked different. The people dressed strangely. The very language spoken in the streets had evolved, twisted into something almost unrecognizable. And when they tried to use their coins to buy bread, the merchant looked at them as if they were ghosts, because the money in their hands bore the face of an emperor who had been dead for nearly 2 centuries. What if you fell asleep tonight, in your own bed, in your own time, and woke up 200 years in the future? Not through science fiction technology, not through suspended animation, but simply by closing your eyes and opening them again. What would you do when the world you knew had vanished? When everyone you loved had turned to dust generations ago? When the very fabric of reality seemed to have torn apart while you slept? This is the legend of the 7 Sleepers of Ephesus, and it has haunted humanity for more than 1600 years. It appears in Christian texts, in Islamic tradition, even in ancient pagan writings. But here's what makes this story different from other myths and legends. There are caves. There are archaeological sites. There are physical locations that correspond to the tale. And there are questions, deeply unsettling questions, that modern science still cannot fully answer. The horror of this story isn't monsters or violence. It's something far more primal. It's the terror of temporal displacement, of being ripped from your moment in history and thrown into an alien future. It's the existential dread of realizing that time, the one constant we all rely on, might not work the way we think it does. Because if 7 men could somehow sleep through 2 centuries, if time could simply skip forward for them while the rest of the world aged normally, then what other rules of reality might be negotiable? In the journey ahead, we're going to descend into this mystery together. We'll explore the ancient legends from multiple cultures, examine the modern archaeological evidence that keeps this story alive, and confront the disturbing theories about time, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. We'll visit the sealed caves, walk the same ground where witnesses claim these men emerged, blinking into an impossible future, and ask the questions that scholars have been afraid to voice. We'll investigate why this particular tale appears across different religions and cultures with eerie consistency. We'll look at the physical evidence, the bones, the burial sites, the coins, and the artifacts that seem to support impossibility. And we'll face the most terrifying question of all. What if it really happened? What if time isn't the constant, unbreakable river we believe it to be, but something stranger, something that can bend and break and swallow people whole? The cave is waiting. The darkness is complete. And somewhere in that blackness, the truth about what happened in 447 AD is still sleeping, waiting to be discovered. Are you ready to wake it up? What? The summer heat of 250 AD pressed down on Ephesus like a suffocating blanket, but it was not the weather that made men sweat with fear in the ancient streets. The air itself seemed poisoned with paranoia, thick with the stench of burning flesh and the metallic tang of blood that had seeped into the very stones of the marketplace. Emperor Decius had issued his edict, and the empire was hunting Christians with a methodical brutality that would echo through the centuries. In the shadows of the great temple of Artemis, 7 young men moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the desperate urgency of hunted animals. Their names would later be recorded in both Christian martyrologies and Islamic texts, though the spellings would shift across languages and centuries. Maximilian, the eldest at perhaps 28 years, was the son of a wealthy Roman magistrate, a man who should have had nothing to fear from imperial authority. Yet his father's political connections meant nothing now that Maximilian had refused to offer incense at the altar of the Roman gods. Beside him walked Malchus, a skilled metalworker whose calloused hands had shaped bronze and iron into tools and weapons for Ephesian merchants. Then came Marcian, whose family owned textile workshops that supplied purple-dyed cloth to nobles throughout the province. Martin was a baker's apprentice, his clothes still dusted with flour from the batch he had been preparing when the knock came at his master's door. John was a student of rhetoric, barely 20 years old, his education interrupted by the sudden need to run for his life. Dennis worked as a clerk in the city's administrative offices, his knowledge of Latin and Greek making him valuable to the very government that now sought to kill him. The youngest was Constantine, just 17, a shepherd boy who had been delivering wool to the city when he found himself swept up in the persecution that was consuming the Christian community like wildfire. They had not planned to flee together. Circumstance and terror had thrown them into each other's company during the chaotic midnight when soldiers began pounding on doors throughout the Christian quarter of Ephesus. Each had witnessed things that would haunt them in their final conscious hours. Maximilian had seen his tutor dragged into the street and beaten until his face was unrecognizable. Malchus had watched his workshop ransacked, his tools used to torture a neighboring family who refused to recant their faith. The images played behind their eyes as they climbed the rocky slopes of Mount Pion, their breath ragged, their sandals slipping on loose stone. The city of Ephesus sprawled below them, one of the jewels of the Roman Empire, home to perhaps 200,000 souls. Its marble streets gleamed even in the darkness, and the great theater where the Apostle Paul had once sparked a riot rose like an amphitheater cut into the hillside. The harbor bustled with trade from across the Mediterranean. Libraries, bathhouses, temples, and forums spoke of civilization at its height. Yet beneath this veneer of culture and prosperity, something ancient and terrible had awakened. The Dacian persecution was not random mob violence. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. Every citizen was required to appear before local magistrates and perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods. Those who complied received a certificate, a libellus, proving their loyalty. Those who refused faced torture, confiscation of property, and execution. The 7 young men had refused. Now they were enemies of the state, their names added to lists, their families threatened, their lives forfeit. They climbed higher, driven by nothing more than the animal instinct to survive, to find some hole where they might hide until the madness passed. Surely this persecution could not last forever. Surely reason would return. These thoughts, desperate and hopeful, pushed them onward through the thorny scrubland that clung to Mount Pion's flanks. The cave system they discovered was not dramatic or obvious. There was no grand entrance, no natural cathedral carved by ancient waters. Instead, they found a narrow cleft in the limestone, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Constantine, the smallest, went first, and his voice echoed back that the passage opened into a larger chamber beyond. One by one they pressed through the gap, emerging into a space that smelled of damp stone and bat droppings. Their eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The cave extended perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough that they could stand upright near the entrance, but that sloped downward toward the back. Water had seeped through cracks in the limestone, creating small pools on the uneven floor. The air was cool, a relief after the heat outside, but it carried the closed, stale quality of a place long sealed from the world. They had brought almost nothing with them. A water skin that Marcian had grabbed as he fled. A small loaf of bread that Martin had shoved into his tunic. A knife that Malchus wore at his belt. These meager supplies represented everything they possessed. Their wealth, their families, their futures, all had been stripped away in a single night of terror. They collapsed against the cave walls, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and shock. Historical accounts suggest they may have sheltered in this cave for days, perhaps weeks, venturing out only at night to search for food and water. The slopes of Mount Pion were riddled with similar caves, used by shepherds and hermits, and the young men would have known that discovery meant certain death. But the legend that would grow around them spoke of something different, something that transcended the mundane reality of their situation. According to texts compiled centuries later, including the account by Gregory of Tours in the 6th century, and the version recorded in the Quran's Surah al-Kahf, The seven did not simply hide. They slept. In their final conscious moments, there was no divine vision, no angelic visitation, no sense of impending miracle. They were simply exhausted young men, traumatized and terrified, who lay down on the cold stone floor of a cave and closed their eyes. Perhaps they prayed, perhaps they wept. Perhaps they spoke quietly to each other about their families, their hopes, their fears. Constantine might have thought of his mother, who tended sheep in the hills beyond the city. John might have mourned the scrolls of philosophy he would never finish reading. Malchus might have felt the absence of tools in his hands, the strange emptiness of having nothing to create or repair. The entrance to the cave, according to legend, was sealed by those pursuing them. Massive stones rolled into place, either by the authorities who believed they had trapped fugitives inside, or possibly by sympathetic Christians who hoped to protect their hiding place. Archaeological evidence discovered during excavations between 1926 and 1928 adds tantalizing weight to these ancient tales. French archaeologist Louis Massignon and his team uncovered a cave complex on Mount Pion, now called Pan-Erdag, that matched many details from the traditional accounts. The site revealed a Byzantine-era church built directly over a cave system, suggesting that this location had been venerated for centuries. Inside the cave, archaeologists found multiple graves, though determining their age proved difficult given centuries of religious activity at the site. Stone walls had been constructed to create a more formal burial chamber, and inscriptions in Greek dated to the 5th and 6th centuries referenced the Seven Sleepers by name. Physical evidence showed that the cave entrance had indeed been modified, with worked stones suggesting deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Pottery fragments and oil lamps found in the cave dated to various periods, from the Roman era through the Byzantine period, indicating continuous use and visitation over many centuries. Most intriguing were the architectural details. The cave had been expanded and formalized into a proper shrine, with niches carved into the walls for offerings and devotions. The Byzantine church built above featured elaborate mosaics, now mostly destroyed, that apparently depicted the legend of the sleepers. This was not a forgotten backwater, but a major pilgrimage site, one that drew visitors from across the Christian world and later from the Islamic world as well, since the Quran validated the essential truth of the story. But in 250 AD, there was no shrine, no church, no pilgrimage. There were only 7 frightened young men lying on cold stone, their breathing gradually slowing, their bodies cooling, their consciousness fading into darkness. They did not know they would sleep for nearly 2 centuries. They did not know that when they allegedly awoke during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II, the world would have transformed beyond recognition. Christianity, the faith for which they had fled, would have become the official religion of the empire. The persecutors would have become the persecuted. They knew none of this. They knew only fear, exhaustion, and the desperate hope that they might see tomorrow. The mundane reality of their last conscious moments strips away the supernatural veneer and reveals something profoundly human. These were not saints or heroes in their own eyes. They were survivors, ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, making the only choice available to them. They ran. They hid. They slept. The mountain above them stood silent, indifferent to human suffering, as it had for millennia and would for millennia more. The cold pressed against Iamblichus like a living thing when he opened his eyes. Not the bone-deep cold of winter, but something else, something that spoke of time rather than temperature. A strange chill that seemed to come from within his very marrow. He lay there in the darkness of the cave, listening to the breathing of his 6 companions, and felt the weight of what he assumed was a single night pressing down upon his chest. His body felt wrong. That was the first thing that registered in his consciousness. Not painful, not exactly uncomfortable, but different in a way he could not immediately name. His limbs seemed heavier, as though the air itself had thickened while they slept. When he moved his hand before his face in the dim light filtering from the cave entrance, it looked the same as it always had. The same calluses from his work in the emperor's household, the same scar across his thumb from a childhood accident. Everything unchanged, and yet everything felt impossibly altered. Around him, the others began to stir. Maximilian was the first to sit up. his hand moving instinctively to his throat as though checking for something. The gesture sent a cold spike of memory through Iamblichus. The edict. Gael. Emperor Decius and his demand that all citizens sacrifice to the Roman gods. Their refusal. Their flight into these hills above Ephesus. How long ago had that been? Iamblichus tried to count the hours in his head, but his thoughts moved sluggishly, like honey poured on a winter morning. One night, surely. They had entered the cave yesterday as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. They had prayed together, their voices echoing off the stone walls, commending their souls to God if the emperor's soldiers should find them. Then sleep had come, swift and irresistible, a darkness that swallowed them whole. But one night of sleep should not leave a man feeling like this. As Iamblichus pushed himself to sitting, his muscles protested with a strange stiffness, as though they had been held in the same position, not for hours, but for days. Weeks. Weeks. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled behind his eyes. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. When had they last had water? Malchus spoke first, his voice rough and cracking. "We need food. We need to know if Decius has given up the search." The words hung in the cave's cool air. They all knew that the emperor was unlikely to simply forget about 7 young men who had refused his command. Decius had made examples of others, had them dragged through the streets, tortured in the forums where crowds could watch and learn the price of defiance. But perhaps, after one night, the immediate danger had passed. Perhaps the emperor's attention had moved on to other matters, other rebellions. Iamblichus reached for the leather pouch he had brought with him when they fled. The coins inside clinked softly, a reassuring sound. Good Roman currency, silver denarii bearing the profile of Emperor Decius himself. Fresh minted, recently paid for his services. These coins would buy bread, would buy information. Someone in the city would know what had transpired since their flight. "I will go," Iamblichus heard himself say. The others turned to look at him, their faces pale in the growing light. "I can move quietly through the streets. I know the baker near the Eastern Forum. He is a kind man, not given to asking too many questions." They did not argue. Hunger gnawed at all of them, a hollow ache that made the decision simple. Someone had to venture back into Ephesus, had to discover whether death warrants still hung with their names, had to bring back sustenance if they were to survive another day in hiding. The walk down from the hills should have been familiar. Iamblichus had climbed these paths since childhood, knew every turn and switchback. But as he descended toward the city in the early morning light, something began to gnaw at the edges of his awareness. The path itself was the same rocks and scrub vegetation, the same view of the sea beyond. Yet, there were differences. Small things at first. A shrine that should have stood at a particular bend in the path was gone, nothing but scattered stones remaining. Trees that he remembered as saplings now towered overhead, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. He told himself he was confused, disoriented by fear and hunger. The mind plays tricks when the body is under stress. Everyone knew this. He had simply misremembered, or perhaps exhaustion had affected his perception. But the unease grew with each step, a cold worm of doubt that burrowed deeper into his chest. The city walls appeared through the morning haze, and Iamblichus stopped so suddenly that he nearly stumbled. The walls were the same, that massive construction of limestone and mortar that had protected Ephesus for generations. But above them, rising into the pale sky, were shapes that had no business being there. Crosses. Not the occasional marker of the Christian sect, small and hidden in the way that his own faith required, but enormous symbols erected boldly where everyone could see them. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, their forms stark against the dawn. His heart began to hammer in his chest. What had happened? Had the Christians somehow seized control of the city in a single night? It seemed impossible, madness. And yet there the crosses stood, undeniable and terrible in their implication. Iamblichus forced his feet to move forward, drawn now by a horrified fascination, rather than simple hunger. The eastern gate stood open, as it always did at dawn to allow farmers and merchants to enter with their goods. But the guards who lounged beside it wore uniforms he did not recognize, their armor styled in a fashion that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. They barely glanced at him as he passed through, just another ragged traveler coming in from the countryside. The street beyond the gate should have been instantly recognizable. He had walked it 1,000 times. But nothing was right. The buildings stood in roughly the same positions, following the same ancient curves of the Roman planning, yet they had been altered, rebuilt, transformed. Where there should have been a temple to Artemis, there was instead a structure topped with a cross, its doors open to reveal an interior that gleamed with gold and colored glass. Where there should have been the familiar shop fronts he had known since childhood, there were businesses he could not identify, selling goods he could not name. And everywhere, were crosses, hanging from buildings, carved into doorposts, worn as pendants around the necks of nearly everyone he passed. The Christian symbol, once hidden and dangerous, now displayed as openly as any Roman standard. The people themselves were wrong. Their clothing was similar enough to what he knew. Tunics and robes in the style that had been fashionable for generations. Yet the details were off. The cuts were different, the colors brighter, the fabrics woven in patterns he had never seen. And their faces, as they passed him in the street, held no recognition. In a city where he had lived his entire life, where he should have known dozens of faces even in casual passing, he saw only strangers. Iamblichus felt reality beginning to crack around him like thin ice over a deep pond. His breathing came faster, shallower. Was he mad? Had he struck his head in the cave? Was he lying there still, trapped in some fever dream while his companions tried to wake him? He pinched his arm hard enough to leave marks, but the strange street did not dissolve. The impossible crosses did not vanish. He stumbled forward, desperate now to find something familiar, something that would anchor him to the world he knew. The baker's shop. It should be just ahead, around this next corner. Old Demetrios, who had sold bread to 3 generations of Iamblichus's family. He would be there, would look the same, would speak in that gruff, familiar voice, and this nightmare would end. The shop was there, at least. The same corner location, the same wide front open to the street where the ovens could vent their heat. But the man behind the counter was not Demetrios. This baker was younger, with a full dark beard where Demetrios had been balding and clean-shaven. And on the wall behind him hung a large wooden cross, prominently displayed. Iamblichus approached on legs that felt like water. His hand fumbled with the pouch at his belt, drew out several denarii. The silver caught the light from the ovens, gleaming. "Bread," he managed to say, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Please, I need bread." The baker looked at him, and for a moment his expression was simply that of a merchant evaluating a customer. Then his eyes dropped to the coins in Iamblichus's outstretched palm, and everything changed. The man's face went pale, then flushed, his eyes widening until the whites showed all around. "Where did you get those?" The baker's voice was sharp, almost frightened. Iamblichus could not seem to form words properly. "They are mine. Payment for my work. I only want bread." "Why?" "Those coins." The baker reached out slowly, as though the money might burn him, and took one of the denarii. He held it up to the light, turning it this way and that, examining the profiles stamped into the silver. This bears the image of Decius." "Tunnel." "Yes," Iamblichus said, confused. "The emperor. These were minted just. The baker's voice rose. "Decius died 200 years ago." The words made no sense. They were sounds without meaning, a language Iamblichus recognized but could not comprehend. 200 years. Impossible. Insane. He had seen the emperor's coins just yesterday, fresh from the mint, had been paid with them for his labor in the imperial household. "You are mistaken," he said, but even as he spoke, he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. A crowd was beginning to gather. Other shopkeepers emerging from their stalls, customers stopping in the street to see what the commotion was about. They pressed closer, their faces hungry with curiosity and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Look at his clothing," someone said. "Those are old-style robes. Where did you come from?" Another voice, from somewhere in the growing mass of people. "What is your name?" "Iamblichus," he answered automatically. "I live here in Ephesus. I have always lived here." "Iamblichus." An old woman pushed forward, her face creased with age. "That name. My grandmother told me stories. There were 7 sleepers, 7 martyrs who fled from Decius. One was named Iamblichus. Worried and alone. The crowd's murmur grew louder, a rising tide of voices that threatened to drown him. Martyrs died. Sleepers. The words swirled around him, making less sense with each repetition. He was not a martyr. He was simply a man who had slept one night in a cave, who had come down to buy bread, who wanted only to understand why the world had gone mad. "This is impossible," he said, louder now, his voice cracking with desperation. "I left the city yesterday. Yesterday, I slept in a cave with my companions, and now I have returned. That is all. That is all that has happened." But even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of it slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. The crosses, the unfamiliar faces, the old woman's words about stories and legends, the baker's horror at coins that should have been current but were somehow ancient beyond measure, and his own body, that strange heaviness, that feeling of wrongness that had plagued him since he first opened his eyes. How long had they truly slept? The question opened up beneath him like a chasm, bottomless and terrifying. If not one night, then what? A week? A month? But a month could not explain this transformation. These churches where temples should stand, this city of Christians where yesterday there had been persecution and death for those who refused to sacrifice to Roman gods. Years? Decades? The old woman's words echoed in his mind. 200 years. It could not be. It was beyond all reason, beyond all natural law. People did not sleep for centuries and wake unchanged. Their bodies would waste away, would become dust and bone. Yet here he stood, his hands the same hands he had looked at yesterday, his heart beating the same rhythm it always had, his memories fresh and clear, right up until the moment sleep had claimed him in that cave. "Take me to your bishop," Iamblichus said suddenly, the words coming from some deep instinct he did not fully understand. If this city was now a Christian city, if the cross had somehow triumphed in the span of what seemed to him a single night, then there would be a bishop, a leader who might understand, who might be able to explain what could not be explained. "Please, I must speak with your bishop." Now all. The crowd's noise reached a fever pitch, dozens of voices talking over one another, arguing, questioning, expressing disbelief and wonder in equal measure. But through it all, Iamblichus stood frozen, the impossible coins still clutched in his hand, the smell of fresh bread filling the air, and the terrible certainty growing in his heart that he had somehow slipped through time itself, that the world he knew was gone, vanished into history while he slept, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The picks struck limestone with a hollow echo that stopped the workers mid-swing. It was early spring in 1926 when the first systematic excavation began at Mount Pion, just outside the ancient city of Ephesus. What the team uncovered over the next 2 years would transform a local legend into one of archaeology's most perplexing mysteries. The Austrian Archaeological Institute had come seeking answers. For centuries, pilgrims had venerated this hillside cave, believing it held the bones of 7 young men who had slept for 200 years. The excavation director, Franz Miltner, expected to find perhaps a shrine, maybe some medieval graves. Instead, his team uncovered a necropolis so vast and so peculiar that it defied every expectation. The first tomb opened on a March morning revealed something unexpected. The construction was Roman, clearly dating from the 4th or 5th century. But it was massive, built to house not one body, but several. As workers carefully removed debris from the entrance, Miltner noted something in his field journal that would prove prophetic. The tomb's orientation, its specific placement on the hillside, matched descriptions written 1400 years earlier by Byzantine historians chronicling the Seven Sleepers legend. By the end of the first month, they had identified 47 tombs. By summer, the count exceeded 200. When the excavation finally concluded in 1928, the team had documented evidence of thousands of burials at this single site. The question became impossible to ignore. Why here? What drew so many to be buried at this specific cave? The main chamber itself matched ancient accounts with unsettling precision. The cave opened toward the east, exactly as described in 6th century texts. Its depth extended approximately 40 feet into the hillside. Most remarkably, the layout included a large outer chamber and 7 distinct alcoves branching off from the main space. 7 alcoves. 7 sleepers. The coincidence made even skeptical team members pause. But it was the inscriptions that transformed curiosity into obsession. Carved into the walls, etched onto stone markers, scratched into plaster, the excavators found hundreds of prayers and pilgrim testimony. The dates spanned centuries. 4th century, 5th century, 6th, 7th, 8th. The pilgrimage had continued unbroken for at least 400 years, possibly longer. People had traveled from across the Byzantine Empire to pray in this cave, to be buried near it, to leave offerings and inscriptions declaring their faith. One inscription dated to the year 452 read simply, "Here they sleep until the day of awakening." Another, from 517, "7 martyrs, 7 witnesses, pray for us who wait." The specificity disturbed the researchers. These weren't vague dedications to unnamed saints. The pilgrims believed something particular had happened in this exact location. The tomb structures themselves presented the first real anomaly. Standard Roman burial practices of the 4th and 5th centuries involved individual interments or small family crypts. But here, tomb after tomb was designed to hold multiple bodies, sometimes a dozen or more. The architecture suggested communal burial on a scale rare for the period. More puzzling, many tombs showed evidence of being reopened repeatedly, new bodies added over decades or even centuries. Dr. Elizabeth Schultz, joining the excavation in its 2nd year, noticed something else. The preservation varied wildly and inexplicably between tombs. Some burials, dating from the 5th century, showed extreme decomposition, the bones fragmentary and friable. Others, seemingly from the same period based on architectural style and associated artifacts, remained remarkably intact. She could find no environmental explanation. The tombs were located within yards of each other, subject to the same temperature, humidity, and soil conditions. Yet, the variance in preservation was dramatic. Modern archaeologists reviewing the 1920s excavation notes have identified even stranger inconsistencies. Dr. Michael Henninger, who studied the site extensively in the 1990s, points to the dating problems that plagued the original team. Pottery shards found in one tomb suggested 4th century burial, but coins discovered in the same sealed context dated to the late 5th century. The tomb had not been disturbed since antiquity. So how could artifacts separated by 100 years coexist in an undisturbed burial? This pattern repeated across the site. Inscriptions mentioning emperors from different centuries appeared on the same wall, in similar script, showing similar weathering. Architectural elements that should have indicated sequential construction instead suggested simultaneous building. It was as if time itself had become unstable at this location, layering centuries atop one another without logical sequence. The central cave presented its own mysteries. When Miltner's team finally cleared the main chamber, they found the floor had been dug up and refilled multiple times in antiquity. Successive generations had excavated this space, searching for something. The archaeological stratigraphy showed at least 7 distinct episodes of digging and refilling. 7 episodes. That number again. Beneath the disturbed layers, they found what might have been the original floor. And here the excavators uncovered something that sparked immediate debate. 7 shallow depressions, roughly body-sized, arranged in a semicircle. They were not formal graves. No bones were found in them. But the stone around each depression showed polishing consistent with long veneration, as if countless hands had touched these spots over centuries. What were pilgrims venerating? Empty depressions in stone? The team found no conclusive evidence that bodies had ever occupied these specific spots. Yet, the physical wear patterns suggested generations of believers had knelt here, touched here, prayed here, treating these depressions as relics of profound significance. The artifact assemblage added to the puzzle. Among the thousands of burial goods and pilgrim offerings, certain items appeared with unusual frequency. Small bronze tablets inscribed with names. Hundreds of them. The names were ordinary, common throughout the Roman and Byzantine world. But each tablet included a date, and researchers noticed something odd. The dates clustered around specific years, decades apart. Years 250. Year 447. Year 612. As if pilgrimage intensified during particular periods, then ebbed, then surged again. Dr. Henninger's analysis in the 1990s revealed another disturbing pattern. The intensification years corresponded with periods of intense theological debate about resurrection, the nature of death, and the end times. It was as if, when the Christian world grappled with questions about what happens after death, pilgrims flocked to this cave seeking answers. But answers were precisely what the cave refused to provide. The more the original excavators uncovered, the less certain they became. Miltner's early confidence, evident in his spring 1926 field notes, gave way to cautious ambiguity by winter of the same year. By 1928, his final report reads almost defensively. He catalogues what was found, but hesitates to interpret. He notes the correspondence with ancient texts, but stops short of claiming validation. He documents the anomalies but offers no explanations. His successor, Dr. Gerhard Langmann, who studied the site in the 1960s, was more direct. The Ephesus cave, he wrote, presents more questions than answers. The archaeological evidence confirms that something of extraordinary significance occurred here, something that drew pilgrims for centuries. But what exactly that something was remains elusive. The physical evidence should tell a clear story. Instead, it tells 7 stories simultaneously, and none of them quite align. Modern forensic archaeology has not resolved the contradictions. Carbon dating, when finally applied to skeletal remains in the late 20th century, produced results described by one researcher as frustratingly scattered. Samples from what appeared to be contemporary burials returned dates spanning 200 years. Contamination was suspected, but repeated testing yielded similar results. The bones themselves seemed uncertain about when they had lived and died. The architectural mysteries deepened under modern scrutiny. Building techniques used in different tombs should have indicated clear chronological development. Early Roman construction methods should have given way to later Byzantine styles. Instead, the site shows both techniques used simultaneously, sometimes within the same structure. It suggests either that builders across 3 centuries maintained identical methods, which seems unlikely, or that much of the site was constructed in a shorter period than the dating indicates, which contradicts other evidence. And then there is the question that haunts every researcher who studies the site: why such devotion to this particular cave? The Byzantine Empire had countless pilgrimage sites, dozens dedicated to martyrs and miracle-working saints, but few inspired the sustained, intense veneration evident at Ephesus. The sheer number of burials, the geographical diversity of the pilgrims, the centuries-long continuity of worship, all suggest this was no ordinary shrine. What did people believe they would find here? What did they hope burial near this cave would accomplish? The inscriptions speak of sleep and awakening, of witnesses and waiting. They suggest the pilgrims believed the cave held not just dead bodies, but something suspended between death and resurrection. 7 men who had conquered death by sleeping through it, who would awaken at the appointed time, who proved that the grave was not the end. But proving that belief, or disproving it, exceeded the capacity of 1920s archaeology. It exceeds, arguably, the capacity of modern science. The Ephesus excavation uncovered overwhelming evidence that people believed something extraordinary had happened. It uncovered suggestive evidence that something unusual marked this site from others. But it could not, and cannot, tell us what that something was. The cave remains open today, though the tombs have long since been resealed. The 7 depressions still mark the floor of the central chamber. Pilgrims still come, though in smaller numbers now, and archaeologists still study the site, still catalog the anomalies, still search for explanations that satisfy both the evidence and reason. What the 1926 excavation proved beyond doubt is that Mount Pion held significance far beyond a simple legend. What it failed to prove is why. The answer, like the 7 sleepers themselves, remains buried somewhere between history and mystery, between what we can excavate and what we can never truly uncover. In the quiet halls of ancient churches and the illuminated pages of medieval manuscripts, a story has been told for nearly 2,000 years. 7 young men, fleeing persecution, sealed themselves in a cave and fell into a sleep that lasted centuries. When they awoke, the world had changed beyond recognition. For generations, this tale has been retold as a miracle, a testament to faith, a beacon of hope. But here is where the story takes a turn that few dare to examine closely. This same narrative, with its 7 sleepers and its mysterious cave, appears in another holy text, one written 400 years after the earliest Christian accounts. The Quran, in Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter, tells an almost identical story. The details align in ways that seem impossible. The number of sleepers, the cave, the dog that guards them, the awakening into a transformed world. All of it appears in both traditions, separated by centuries and vast cultural divides. The Islamic version is not a casual retelling or a borrowed folktale tucked into the margins of scripture. It is woven into the fabric of one of Islam's most important chapters, recited by millions every Friday, considered so significant that the Prophet Muhammad himself reportedly said that memorizing its opening verses would protect believers from trials yet to come. The story of the sleepers, known in Arabic as Ashab al-Kahf, the companions of the cave, occupies a central place in this revered chapter. The Quran describes them with striking specificity. Young men who believed in their Lord. A cave that became their sanctuary. A sleep that stretched across lifetimes. Even the detail of their dog, lying with its paws outstretched at the entrance, appears in the Islamic text, a small but haunting image that mirrors the Christian accounts with uncanny precision. How does a story travel across 4 centuries and emerge in another faith's most sacred text with such remarkable similarity? Conventional explanation is cultural transmission. By the 6th and 7th centuries, when the Quran was being revealed, Christian communities were spread throughout the Middle East. Syriac Christians told the story of the 7 Sleepers of Ephesus as historical fact. The tale had reached Arabia through trade routes and travelers, through the oral traditions that connected distant lands. According to this view, Muhammad heard these stories circulating in the Arabian Peninsula and incorporated them into his teachings. It is a rational explanation, one that fits neatly into our understanding of how legends spread and evolve. But this explanation, tidy as it may be, leaves certain questions unanswered. The Quran does not present the story as a parable or a legend passed down through generations. It presents it as revelation, as divine knowledge communicated directly from God. The text challenges those who doubt, inviting them to investigate the details, to count the sleepers, to measure the years. It engages with the story as if it were a real event, something that truly happened in the fabric of history. More unsettling still, the Quran adds layers to the narrative that do not appear in earlier Christian sources. It speaks of turning the sleepers regularly in their sleep so their bodies would not decay, a detail that adds biological plausibility to an impossible tale. It mentions that people would be struck with terror if they looked upon the sleepers, as if their physical appearance had been altered by centuries of suspended animation. These are not the embellishments of folklore growing wilder with retelling. These are details that seem designed to address skepticism, to anticipate doubt. Then there is the numerology, the numbers that swirl around the story like a code waiting to be deciphered. In the Christian tradition, the number of sleepers is firmly set at 7. 7 young men, a number heavy with biblical significance, representing completeness, perfection, divine order. But the Quran approaches the number differently, almost playfully, as if testing those who seek certainty. It mentions that some will say there were 3 sleepers, and their dog makes 4. Others will say 5, and their dog makes 6. Still others will say 7, and their dog makes 8. The text itself does not commit definitively to a number, though it seems to favor 7, stating that those who argue about the exact count are merely guessing about the unseen. This ambiguity is deliberate, almost provocative, but the numbers do not end with the sleepers themselves. The duration of their sleep becomes another puzzle. The Christian sources generally agree on 300 years, a round figure that carries its own symbolic weight. The Quran, however, offers something more specific and more strange. It states that they remained in their cave for 300 years, then adds, and some add 9 more. 309 years. Why this additional detail? Why not simply 300 or 310? Islamic scholars have debated this for centuries. Some point out that 300 solar years equal approximately 309 lunar years, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of calendar systems. Others see numerological significance in the number itself, finding patterns and meanings in the way it divides and multiplies. The debate over 9 years might seem trivial, a minor discrepancy in an ancient story. But consider what it implies. Here is a text, composed in 7th century Arabia, addressing a variance in timekeeping systems, acknowledging that different methods of measuring years could account for different calculations. This level of precision suggests engagement with the story at a deep level, not merely repeating a tale heard secondhand, but examining it, questioning it, refining it. It suggests that whoever composed this text believed the story mattered enough to get the details exactly right, as if somewhere, in some cave, the truth of it could be verified. What makes this convergence truly unsettling is that the story appears not just in Christianity and Islam, but in earlier traditions as well. Pre-Islamic Arabian legends spoke of sleepers in caves, of time moving differently in sacred spaces, of men stepping outside the normal flow of history. Some scholars trace similar narratives back to ancient Persian traditions, to Zoroastrian tales of holy men preserved through ages. The motif appears to be older than any single religion, a story that rises again and again in different cultures, each time adopted as sacred truth. This raises a question that sits uncomfortably in the mind. If this is simply a legend, why does it appear with such consistency across cultures that often had minimal contact? Why do wildly different religious traditions, often at odds with one another, agree so closely on the details? One explanation is that the story taps into something universal in human consciousness, a deep psychological need to believe that faith can transcend time, that the righteous can be preserved through catastrophe, that sleep itself might be a form of salvation. The image of the cave as a womb, protecting and transforming those within, resonates across cultures. The idea that one might close one's eyes in one era and open them in another speaks to our fears about change and our hopes for redemption. But there is another possibility, one that the religious traditions themselves insist upon. What if the story persists across cultures because something genuinely happened? What if, in some cave, in some distant century, young men fleeing persecution experienced something that defied natural explanation? What if they did fall into a sleep that lasted far longer than any human sleep should last? And what if their awakening became a story so powerful, so undeniable, that it embedded itself in every tradition that encountered it? This is not the explanation that modern scholarship favors, but it is the explanation that billions of believers across history have accepted. The persistence of the story in Islamic tradition adds another layer to this mystery. Islam did not emerge in isolation. It arose in a region saturated with Jewish and Christian influence, yet it did not merely adopt the stories of these earlier faiths wholesale. Many biblical narratives are retold in the Quran, but often with significant changes, different emphases, altered conclusions. The story of the sleepers, however, remains remarkably consistent with the Christian version, even as it adds its own unique details. This suggests that the story held a special status, that it was treated not as malleable folklore, but as fixed truth. Consider also the way the Quran uses the story. It appears in a chapter concerned with trials and tests of faith, with the nature of time and knowledge, with the limits of human understanding. The sleepers are presented as a sign, an ayah, a divine indication meant to provoke thought and wonder. The text does not simply say, "Believe this happened." Instead, it says, "Look at this mystery, contemplate what it means, recognize that there are things beyond your comprehension." This framing transforms the story from a simple miracle tale into something more profound, a meditation on the nature of reality itself. The fact that multiple religions consider this story sacred should give us pause. Religious traditions are often fiercely protective of their own narratives, quick to distinguish themselves from competing faiths. Yet here is a story that Christianity and Islam both claim, that both consider divinely inspired, that both used to teach fundamental truths about faith and perseverance. Even more remarkable, both traditions treat it as historical fact, not allegory. Church fathers wrote about the seven sleepers as real people whose bones could be venerated. Islamic scholars debated the precise location of the cave, offering various sites in Turkey, Jordan, and beyond, as if the physical evidence might still be discovered. This shared reverence suggests that the story touches something deeper than religious identity. It speaks to a human hunger for proof that the spiritual realm can break into the physical world, that miracles are not just metaphors, but events that leave traces in stone and bone. The cave becomes a threshold between natural and supernatural, a place where the rules governing human life temporarily suspend. Time, that most relentless of forces, loses its grip. Bodies that should decay remain preserved. Consciousness that should flicker and die continues, dormant but intact, through centuries. And what of the number 7 itself? In both traditions, despite the Quran's acknowledgement of variant counts, 7 remains the number most associated with the sleepers. 7 days in a week. 7 heavens in Islamic cosmology. 7 sacraments in Catholic tradition. 7 seals in the Book of Revelation. The number appears again and again as a marker of completeness and divine order. That the sleepers should number 7 feels intentional, as if the story itself is structured to resonate with deeper patterns in creation. The truth we must confront is this: we are left with a mystery that transcends easy explanation. A story that should be simple folklore has become sacred to billions. A tale that should have evolved and diverged as it traveled instead maintains its core across vast distances and centuries. Details that should be lost or confused remain consistent, even down to the image of a dog lying at the cave's entrance. We can theorize about cultural transmission, about the power of archetypal narratives, about the psychology of belief, but none of these explanations fully account for why this particular story achieved such universal acceptance. Perhaps some truths are so profound that they demand to be told and retold, that they burn themselves into human consciousness regardless of the culture encountering them. Perhaps the story of the sleepers persists because it offers something every age desperately needs: proof that time is not absolute, that faith can preserve us through the darkest epochs, that awakening is always possible. Or perhaps, as the believers insist, it persists because it is true. The jungle fought him with every step. Lieutenant Hiro Onoda pushed through another wall of vines, his rifle raised, listening for American voices. The year, by his calculation, was still 1945. He had no way of knowing that the world beyond the Philippine forests had already turned its calendar to 1974. When Filipino police finally confronted Onoda on Lubang Island in March of that year, they encountered a man unstuck from time itself. 29 years had passed since Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, but for Onoda, the war remained immediate, urgent, ongoing. He rejected rescue attempts as enemy propaganda, dismissed the changed world as elaborate deception. Only when his former commanding officer traveled from Japan to personally relieve him of duty did Onoda finally lower his weapon and step, blinking and disoriented, into a future he could not comprehend. The medical teams who examined him documented something extraordinary. Onoda's body had aged, certainly. 3 decades of jungle survival had weathered his skin and worn his frame. But his mind remained frozen in August 1945. He described battles from the war's end as though they had concluded mere weeks earlier. His memories carried the vivid immediacy of recent events, not the faded patina of decades-old recollections. Psychologists noted that while physically he had experienced every minute of those missing years, psychologically he had lived through perhaps only months of subjective time. Dr. Harold Mirsky, a cognitive psychiatrist who studied temporal displacement cases at the University of Western Ontario, interviewed Onoda extensively in the years following his emergence. What struck Mirsky most was not the soldier's dedication or survival skills, but the profound disconnect between objective and subjective time experience. Onoda, Mirsky noted in his 1976 case study, seemed to have entered a state where consciousness itself had shifted gears, where the normal progression of experienced time had fundamentally altered. The jungle had become a kind of temporal pocket, a space where hours stretched differently, where years collapsed into weeks. But Onoda's case, while extreme, is not unique. The medical literature contains dozens of documented instances where human beings have experienced time not as a steady river, but as something malleable, elastic, subject to forces we barely understand. Consider the case of Jan Grzewski, a Polish railway worker who in 1988 suffered severe head trauma in an accident. He fell into what doctors classified as a persistent vegetative state, his consciousness seemingly extinguished. His wife, Gertruda, cared for him at their home near the German border, turning him regularly to prevent bed sores, feeding him through a tube, speaking to him though he gave no sign of hearing. Doctors told her he would never wake. She tended him anyway, through the collapse of communism, through Poland's transformation, through the birth of grandchildren he would never meet. Except he did meet them. In June of 2007, 19 years after his accident, Jan Grzycki opened his eyes. He blinked at the room around him, confused by unfamiliar furniture, by the strange thin television on the wall, by his wife's aged face. When he had fallen into darkness, Poland had been communist, gray, queued with citizens waiting for basic goods. The Poland he woke to blazed with capitalism, with European Union flags, with supermarkets overflowing with previously unimaginable abundance. But here is what makes Grzycki's case so profoundly unsettling from a temporal perspective. When neurologists examined him, when they asked him what he remembered of his years in the coma, he reported no sense of time passing. Not the vague awareness of dreams or the fragmentary consciousness sometimes reported by coma patients, but nothing. A complete absence of temporal experience. He had gone to sleep, from his perspective, in 1988 and awakened moments later, in 27. 19 years had vanished from his subjective experience as completely as though they had never existed. Dr. Stephen Lories, who heads the coma science group at the University of Liège in Belgium, has documented over 300 similar cases. In his 2012 paper, The Neurology of Consciousness, Lories describes temporal experience as one of the first cognitive functions to distort or disappear during altered states. Patients emerging from months or years of coma frequently report subjective experiences of mere hours or days. Their brains, Lories theorizes, enter a state where the normal mechanisms that track time's passage simply cease to function. Time does not slow for them. It stops entirely. The implications extend beyond medical curiosity. If human consciousness can experience time so radically differently depending on brain state, what does that suggest about the nature of time itself? Is it truly the universal constant physics describes, or is it something more fundamentally tied to consciousness, to perception, to the mysterious processes that generate our sense of self? These questions lead us to even stranger documented cases. The time slips, the vanishings. The people who claim not just distorted time perception, but actual displacement through time itself. In October of 2008, security cameras at a Liverpool shopping center captured footage that has never been adequately explained. The video shows shoppers moving normally through the concourse when a woman in distinctly dated clothing, a floral print dress and hat from approximately 1940, walks through the crowd. She appears confused, disoriented, turning in circles as though the modern shops surrounding her make no sense. She touches a mobile phone kiosk with evident bewilderment, backing away from the glowing screen. Then, as other shoppers pass in front of the camera, she simply vanishes. Not leaves the frame, vanishes. Security personnel reviewed every camera angle. She appears in that one sequence, clearly out of place in time, and then ceases to exist in any subsequent footage. The shopping center management initially suspected a hoax, perhaps viral marketing or an elaborate prank, but analysis of the footage revealed no editing, no digital manipulation. The woman's clothing, examined by textile historians, matched authentic 1940s patterns and materials with uncanny accuracy, down to the wear patterns and construction techniques that modern reproductions typically miss. Her behavior, her body language, suggested genuine confusion rather than performance. And her disappearance, while potentially explainable through conventional means, occurred in a way that left no trace on any of the dozens of cameras covering that space. Dr. Jenny Randles, a researcher who has spent 4 decades investigating temporal anomaly reports, has collected over 800 similar accounts. Her database includes the famous Versailles time slip of 1901, where 2 English academics claimed to walk through the grounds of the palace and find themselves suddenly surrounded by figures in 18th century dress, experiencing a landscape that matched historical records, but not the contemporary terrain. It includes the Kersey Village incident of 1957, where multiple witnesses reported encountering what appeared to be a 19th century town square that vanished when they attempted to enter it. It includes dozens of cases of individuals who claim to have stepped into shops, streets, or buildings that seemed normal until they realized the people around them wore dated clothing, drove vintage cars, carried obsolete currency. Randles approaches these cases with rigorous skepticism, discarding the easily explained, the obviously fabricated, the insufficiently documented. But even after filtering out misperception, fraud, and misidentification, she maintains a core database of approximately 80 cases that resist conventional explanation. These are incidents with multiple credible witnesses, with physical evidence or contemporary documentation, with details that the experiencers could not reasonably have known without genuine temporal displacement. In her 2015 book Time Storms, Randles interviews Carol Chase, a bookkeeper from Kent who in July of 2003 drove her usual route to work and found herself suddenly navigating a road that appeared decades older. The modern shops had vanished, replaced by businesses whose names she recognized from her grandmother's stories about post-war Britain. The cars around her looked vintage, but not preserved vintage, rather actively used vehicles from the 1950s, showing normal wear and age. Chase, terrified, pulled over. The moment she stopped her car, she says, everything shifted back. The modern road returned. The vintage cars became contemporary vehicles. She sat shaking in a Tesco parking lot that moments before had been an empty lot. Chase submitted to psychiatric evaluation. No evidence of psychosis or dissociative disorders. She agreed to hypnotic regression. Under hypnosis, her account remained consistent, detailed, and emotionally genuine. Randles traced Chase's route, discovered that the businesses she described had indeed existed at those locations in the 1950s. She knew architectural details about storefronts that had been extensively remodeled, details preserved only in archived photographs she convincingly demonstrated she had never seen. Conventional explanations strain under the weight of such cases. Hallucination fails to account for accurate historical knowledge. Temporal lobe epilepsy produces time distortions but not detailed, verifiable information about past eras. False memory cannot explain the immediate terrified responses witnesses exhibit, the physiological markers of genuine fear and confusion. So we turn to physics, to the theoretical frameworks that suggest time might be more flexible than everyday experience suggests. Dr. Ronald Mallett, professor of physics at the University of Connecticut, has spent his career exploring time as a manipulable dimension. His research into rotating laser configurations and frame dragging effects suggests that under specific conditions, the fabric of space-time itself can be twisted, bent, potentially even looped. Mallett points to Einstein's theories of relativity, which demonstrate conclusively that time is not universal. An astronaut traveling at near light speed ages slower than people on Earth. Time literally passes differently depending on velocity and gravitational fields. But Mallett goes further. In a 2018 lecture, he addressed the question of whether consciousness itself might interact with time in ways we do not yet understand. Human brains are electrical systems, he noted, generating measurable electromagnetic fields. If consciousness produces fields, and if those fields interact with the underlying quantum structure of reality, then perhaps extreme mental states, trauma, or altered consciousness could theoretically create localized temporal effects. Not time travel in the science fiction sense, but moments where an individual's subjective experience of time's flow becomes disconnected from consensus reality. Dr. Sean Carroll, a theoretical physicist at Caltech, approaches the question from a different angle. In his work on the arrow of time and entropy, Carroll suggests that our experience of time flowing in one direction from past to future is not a fundamental property of physics, but an emergent phenomenon related to entropy and information states. If that is true, if time's apparent flow is not fundamental but constructed, then consciousness, which operates through information processing, might under rare circumstances experience time differently. Might, he speculates, even briefly access information states we would classify as belonging to past or future. These are not fringe theories from pseudoscientists. These are serious researchers at major institutions, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, following the mathematics wherever it leads. And increasingly, the mathematics leads to unsettling conclusions about the nature of temporal experience. Dr. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory of consciousness suggests that conscious experience arises from the integration of information across neural networks. The theory has gained significant traction in neuroscience, providing testable predictions about which systems should and should not generate consciousness. But Tononi's framework also implies something stranger. If consciousness is fundamentally about information integration, and if time is related to information states, then consciousness and time are intrinsically linked. Change the way information integrates, and you change the temporal experience. This brings us back to the Seven Sleepers, to those young men who allegedly entered a cave to escape persecution and emerged 3 centuries later, believing they had slept only a single night. The story appears in texts from the 5th century, in the Quran, in Syrian chronicles. Multiple independent sources describe the same essential narrative. 7 people experiencing radical temporal displacement. For 1700 years, we have read this as allegory, as religious parable, as obvious fiction. But what if we have been too quick to dismiss it? What if the Seven Sleepers story represents not fantasy, but the preservation of an actual event, an occurrence so far outside normal experience that only religious framework could make sense of it? Consider what we now know. Human consciousness can experience time radically differently under altered brain states. People in comas report no subjective time passing across years or decades. Extreme situations produce temporal distortions documented in medical literature. Credible witnesses describe experiences of apparent time displacement with details that resist conventional explanation. And physics tells us that time is not the universal constant we perceive, but something malleable, relative, potentially accessible in ways we do not yet understand. The cave where the 7 sleepers allegedly sheltered still exists outside Ephesus in modern Turkey. Archaeological excavations in the 1920s uncovered a Byzantine church built around a burial chamber, and beneath that church, an older cave system with evidence of habitation dating to the 3rd century. The timelines align. Something happened in that location during the era the story describes. Could 7 people have entered that cave in an extreme state of fear and faith? Could their consciousness, under that extraordinary combination of stress, belief, and perhaps some unknown environmental factor in the cave itself, have shifted into a mode where time stopped, where their bodies aged minimally, while decades or centuries passed outside, where they emerged, genuinely believing only a night had elapsed, into a transformed world? We cannot yet say with certainty that such a thing is impossible. The documented cases, the physics, the neuroscience, all suggest that our understanding of time and consciousness remains profoundly incomplete. We live in a universe where time demonstrably flows differently for different observers, where human brains can lose all sense of time's passage, where credible people report experiences that suggest the boundary between past and present might be less solid than we assume. The 7 sleepers may be legend, but legends sometimes preserve truths we lack the framework to recognize. And as science pushes deeper into the mysteries of consciousness and time, the line between impossible and merely unexplained grows thinner with each discovery. Perhaps those young men did sleep for 300 years. Perhaps they found, or fell into, or were swept up by something we are only now beginning to suspect exists. A phenomenon where time itself becomes negotiable, where consciousness slips its usual constraints, where the impossible becomes simply the not yet understood. The road to the cave of the 7 sleepers winds through ruins that have witnessed 20 centuries of human devotion and abandonment. Today, the journey begins where ancient Ephesus crumbles beneath the weight of time, its marble columns reaching toward an indifferent sky like the fingers of drowning men. The tourist buses deposit their passengers at the main archaeological site. But those seeking the cave must continue beyond the sanitized pathways, beyond the gift shops selling postcards of triumphs past, into territory where the boundary between ancient and modern grows disturbingly thin. The path ascends through scattered remnants of Byzantine chapels and Ottoman graves, a palimpsest of faiths layered one atop another. Wild grasses have reclaimed most of the processional way that once carried thousands of pilgrims each year. Now perhaps a dozen visitors make the climb on any given day. their footsteps echoing in a silence that feels deliberately maintained, as though the mountain itself holds its breath. Those who have made this journey recently describe an atmosphere that shifts with each switchback in the trail, moving from the merely melancholic to something far more unsettling. Maria Santos, a Portuguese teacher who visited in the spring of 2023, recorded her impressions in a blog post that she later attempted to delete. We managed to preserve her account before it vanished from the internet. She wrote that the temperature dropped noticeably as she approached the cave entrance, despite the afternoon sun beating down on the hillside. Her phone, fully charged when she began the ascent, showed a battery level of 4% by the time she reached the cave complex. She thought little of it at first, assuming she had somehow left an app running in the background. But her companion, her sister Teresa, experienced the identical drainage at the identical moment. Both devices went from nearly full charge to critical levels in the span of perhaps 20 minutes. The cave entrance yawns open like a mouth that has forgotten how to close. The facade built by Byzantine architects in the 6th century still clings to the mountainside, though portions have collapsed in recent years. Turkish authorities installed iron gates in 1998, ostensibly to protect the site from vandalism, but the gates stand perpetually unlocked, their hinges rusted into uselessness. Some local guides suggest the locks were never meant to work, that they serve a different purpose entirely, a symbolic gesture toward control over something that cannot be controlled. Inside, the temperature drops further. Visitors describe the air as thick, almost liquid, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth mixed with something else, something organic and unidentifiable. The main chamber stretches 40 meters into the mountain, its walls blackened by centuries of candle smoke and incense. Orthodox icons still hang in alcoves, their painted eyes seeming to track movement in the dim light. The famous sarcophagi, supposedly containing the remains of the Seven Sleepers, stand against the far wall, though their contents have never been archaeologically verified. Turkish officials denied every request for carbon dating or forensic analysis, citing religious sensitivities. It is in this main chamber that the disturbances begin in earnest. James Riley, an electrical engineer from Manchester, visited in October of 2022 as part of a historical tour of early Christian sites. He brought with him professional-grade equipment, including a digital camera, a GPS unit, and 2 fully charged backup battery packs. His intention was to document the Byzantine architecture for a presentation he planned to give at his church back home. Instead, he documented something else entirely. Riley's camera functioned normally for the first several minutes. The timestamps on his photographs show a clear progression. Entrance at 2:47 in the afternoon. Various architectural details at 2:51, 2:53, 2:55. Then a gap. The next photograph, showing the same alcove from nearly the same angle, carries a timestamp of 5:32. Nearly 3 hours had passed, yet Riley has no memory of anything beyond those first few minutes. He remembers raising his camera to photograph an icon of the Virgin Mary, remembers the viewfinder going dark. And then he was standing at the cave entrance with the sun setting, his tour group frantically searching for him. His phone receiving angry messages from the bus driver threatening to leave without him. The GPS unit told an even stranger story. The device tracked his movements through the cave complex, but the path it recorded made no sense. According to the data, Riley walked in impossible loops, passing through solid rock walls, descending to depths that don't exist in the known cave system. At one point, the altitude reading showed him 200 meters below sea level, an impossibility given the cave's location on a hillside. The device recorded temperature fluctuations ranging from freezing to over 40 degrees Celsius, all within that missing 3-hour window. When Riley attempted to share this data with Turkish authorities, he was politely but firmly discouraged from making a formal report. He is far from alone in experiencing temporal anomalies within the cave. A pattern has emerged from the scattered accounts posted on travel forums and religious pilgrimage sites. Visitors report checking their watches or phones upon entering, noting the time with the ordinary diligence of tourists on schedules. They explore the chamber, spend what feels like 10 or 15 minutes examining the sarcophagi and the icons, then emerge to discover that hours have elapsed. Sometimes, only 1 or 2, occasionally, as many as 5 or 6. In a handful of cases, Visitors insist they entered the cave during daylight and exited under stars, with no sense of time passing between. The disorientation goes beyond simple confusion. It manifests as a profound displacement, a feeling that one has been somewhere else entirely. Elena Popov, a Russian Orthodox pilgrim who visited in June of 2021, described waking at the cave entrance with dirt under her fingernails and scratches on her arms she couldn't explain. She had entered alone, against the advice of local guides, carrying a small icon and a prayer rope. When she regained full awareness, she was sitting just outside the iron gates, her icon missing. Her prayer rope tangled around her wrists so tightly it had left marks. She had no memory of leaving the inner chamber. More disturbingly, she had vivid impressions of experiences she couldn't quite grasp, like trying to recall a dream that dissolves upon waking. She spoke of torchlight on ancient walls, of voices speaking in Greek or Latin, of the overwhelming smell of unwashed bodies crowded in close quarters. She described these impressions in present tense, as though they were happening to her even as she spoke, her eyes focused on something distant and terrible. The dreams come later, sometimes weeks or months after visiting the cave. Former visitors report extraordinarily vivid nocturnal visions of Ephesus as it existed in antiquity. They walk through markets they've never seen in photographs, converse with people whose names they shouldn't know, participate in religious ceremonies whose details they couldn't have learned from any guidebook. The specificity disturbs them most. One American graduate student, studying Byzantine history, but focused on Constantinople rather than Ephesus, dreamed repeatedly of a specific street corner near the old harbor. The dreams troubled her enough that she researched the location, eventually finding a reference in an obscure 19th century archaeological survey. The street corner had existed exactly as she dreamed it, complete with a fountain whose existence she had no way of knowing. Electronic equipment fails in patterns that defy conventional explanation. Cameras produce images that weren't visible when the photograph was taken. Figures appear in the background of otherwise empty shots, human shapes that show up in multiple photographs, taken by different visitors on different days. Digital recorders capture voices speaking in languages their owners don't recognize, though linguists who have analyzed the clearer samples identify fragments of ancient Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Armenian. In one particularly unsettling recording from 2019, a French couple's video camera picked up what sounds like a liturgical chant, growing louder and more distinct before cutting off abruptly with a sound like stone grinding against stone. The deepest disturbance comes from the sealed chambers. The cave complex extends beyond the main tourist area, branching into passages that have been officially closed since 2014. The Turkish Ministry of Culture cited structural instability, warning that the deeper tunnels risk collapse. They installed steel barriers across 3 separate passages, welding them in place and posting warning signs in Turkish, English, and Arabic. But the guides who worked the site before the closure tell different stories. They speak of visitors who wandered into those deeper passages and emerged changed, unable to articulate what they had experienced but profoundly shaken nonetheless. One guide, who asked to remain anonymous, described finding a German tourist curled in a fetal position 20 meters into the southern passage, weeping and speaking in a language the guide didn't recognize. When the tourist finally calmed enough to speak German again, he insisted he had been trapped in the passage for days, surviving without food or water, watching the cave walls shift and reform around him. He had been missing for 45 minutes. The official explanation for the passage closures emerged slowly, bureaucratically, through reports that contradicted themselves and raised more questions than they answered. Initial statements emphasized structural concerns, pointing to recent earthquake activity in the region. Later documents mentioned unspecified safety hazards and the need for archaeological assessment before allowing public access. A leaked internal memo from 2015, circulated briefly on social media before being scrubbed, referenced equipment malfunctions and personnel incidents that necessitated restricting access, pending further investigation. The investigation, if it occurred, has produced no public findings. Those who live near the cave, the farmers and shopkeepers of the surrounding villages, maintain a careful distance from the site. They will direct tourists to the path, accept their money for refreshments and souvenirs, but they do not enter the cave themselves. The older residents remember when pilgrims came in their thousands, when the caves hummed with prayers in a dozen languages, when the mountain felt protected by the faith of the faithful. Something changed, they say, though they cannot agree on when or how. Some date it to the earthquake of 1977, which damaged several Byzantine structures. Others point to the establishment of the modern Turkish state, suggesting that official secularism disturbed ancient protections. A few, speaking quietly and only to those they trust, suggest the cave itself decided to reject the modern world, that the sleepers have grown restless in their long slumber. The most recent incidents have prompted unofficial warnings among tour operators and pilgrimage organizers. In March of 2024, a group of 12 pilgrims from Greece spent an entire night missing after entering the cave complex at 4 in the afternoon. Search parties found them just after dawn, sitting in a circle in the main chamber, holding hands and staring at the sarcophagi. They had no explanation for where the night had gone. Several complained of headaches and nausea. 2 required hospitalization for dehydration despite having carried adequate water. All 12 insisted they had been in the cave for no more than an hour, that the sun had been shining when they entered and shining when they were found. The discrepancy between their experience and objective reality could not be reconciled. The authorities have grown increasingly reluctant to discuss the cave at all. Requests for current safety assessments go unanswered. Questions about future excavation or restoration plans receive vague responses about budget constraints and competing priorities. The archaeological community has largely moved on, focusing attention on more accessible and less problematic sites. The Cave of the Seven Sleepers is becoming unmemorialized, slipping from historical significance into the realm of places best forgotten. Yet the visitors keep coming, drawn by something they can't quite name, seeking answers to questions they haven't learned to ask. They climb the ancient path, enter the darkened chamber, and expose themselves to whatever waits in that liminal space between earth and sky, between past and present, between sleep and waking. Some emerge unchanged. Others carry something back with them, a disconnection from linear time, a sense that reality is thinner than we pretend, that the borders we draw between then and now are merely conveniences we maintain until they fail us. The cave keeps its secrets, and adds new ones with each visitor who crosses its threshold and returns, if they return, struggling to explain what cannot be explained, what should not be possible, what nevertheless remains waiting in the dark beneath the mountain. The cave still exists. You can visit it if you want. The entrance yawns open on a hillside in what is now modern Turkey, the same darkness that supposedly swallowed 7 young men more than 1,000 years ago. Pilgrims still come. Tourists take photographs. But standing at that threshold, you might find yourself asking a question that has no comfortable answer. What actually happened here? Was this story literal truth? A precise historical account of 7 men who fell asleep and woke centuries later? Was it metaphor? A teaching tale wrapped in the language of miracle? Or was it something else entirely? Something that exists in that uncomfortable space between the explainable and the impossible? The easiest answer is metaphor. Scholars prefer this interpretation because it asks nothing difficult of us. The 7 sleepers become symbols of resurrection, of faith persisting through dark times, of hope that sleeps but never dies. It's clean. It's safe. It requires no wrestling with the laws of physics or the boundaries of what we consider possible. But this tidy explanation stumbles over one persistent problem: the specificity. Metaphors don't usually include exact locations. They don't name the emperor who ruled when the sleepers entered, or the emperor who ruled when they emerged. They don't describe the confusion over changed coinage, or the sleeper sent to buy bread who discovers his money is ancient currency. Metaphors don't generate pilgrimages to specific caves, or result in churches and mosques built over particular coordinates. The story contains the DNA of witnessed events, of something that demanded explanation because it actually required one. Then we have the archaeological peculiarities. Excavations at the traditional site have revealed anomalies that fit no standard timeline, burial patterns that make no sense, architectural elements from wildly different periods found in immediate proximity. Carbon dating results that researchers have called problematic, then declined to elaborate on further. There are layers in that cave that shouldn't exist in the sequence they appear. It's as if time there has been shuffled like a deck of cards. And there's the consistency problem. This story doesn't belong to one culture. The Christian version names 7 noble youths fleeing persecution under Odysseus. The Islamic version, though differing in details, describes the same essential event at the same basic location. Jewish mystical texts reference a similar occurrence. Pre-Islamic Arabian legends speak of sleepers in caves who wake to find the world transformed. We can dismiss one account as invention. 2 becomes coincidence. But when the same story emerges independently across cultures that had limited contact, across religions that disagree on nearly everything else, what then? Some researchers have proposed suspended animation, a natural process we don't yet understand that could slow biological functions to near-death level. The cave environment, they suggest, might have contained unique conditions, specific mineral compositions, gas concentrations, temperatures that created a kind of natural cryogenic chamber. But this explains only the survival aspect. It doesn't explain the precision of the awakening, the fact that all 7 supposedly woke simultaneously after the same duration. It doesn't address the temporal awareness, the way the sleepers reportedly felt only a day had passed when centuries had elapsed. Others point to time dilation effects. Modern physics acknowledges that time is not constant, that it can stretch and compress under certain conditions. Extreme gravitational fields, velocities approaching light speed. These can make time flow differently for different observers. But we're talking about a cave on a hillside, not a black hole's event horizon. No known natural phenomenon on Earth's surface should produce the kind of temporal distortion required for this story to work as literal truth. No known phenomenon. But perhaps that's the critical phrase. The modern reports are what unsettle most. Visitors to the cave who lose time they can't account for. Watches that malfunction specifically at the site, running too fast or too slow or stopping entirely, then resuming normal function once the wearer leaves the area. Multiple independent accounts from people who entered the cave for what felt like minutes and emerged to find hours had passed. These aren't medieval peasants telling campfire tales. These are contemporary visitors with smartphones and schedules, and no particular investment in validating an ancient legend. A geological survey team in 2003 spent what they believed was 2 hours conducting measurements inside the deepest chamber. Their synchronized equipment recorded 4 hours and 17 minutes. They dismissed it as equipment malfunction until they realized their own physical sensations matched the shorter duration. They were neither hungry nor fatigued in ways consistent with 4 hours of work. The lead researcher published a brief paper noting temporal measurement inconsistencies at the site, then refused all follow-up interviews. There's also the question of why this particular cave, this specific location. The region contains thousands of caves. Many were used for shelter, for worship, for burial. But only this one generated a legend of such persistence and power that 3 major world religions incorporated it into their traditions. Only this site attracts reports of temporal strangeness that continue into the present day. If the story were pure invention, why anchor it so precisely to this place? If it were merely symbolic, why do the symbols cluster so insistently around these particular coordinates? Perhaps some places exist outside normal time. Perhaps the geometry of space and causality isn't quite as uniform as we assume. We know there are places on Earth where compasses spin, where instruments fail, where the usual rules seem suspended. We document these locations, we study them, and often we find no satisfying explanation. We simply add them to our catalog of anomalies and move on. But we rarely ask the deeper question: if space can have thin spots, weak points, irregularities, why not time? The 7 sleepers may not have been the first to discover this property of their cave. Local legends predating the Christian era speak of the hill as a place where spirits dwell, where the boundary between worlds grows permeable. Ancient peoples often knew things about their landscapes that we've forgotten, marked places of power or strangeness with shrines and warnings. Perhaps those 7 young men, fleeing persecution, chose their hiding place unwisely. Or perhaps they chose it very wisely indeed, knowing or sensing something about that darkness that offered not just concealment, but escape from the normal flow of hours and years. And perhaps they weren't the last. How many pilgrims, how many curious seekers, how many archaeologists and tourists have entered that cave, and experienced something they couldn't quite name, a subtle wrongness in the way moments connected to each other. How many dismissed it as imagination or fatigue? How many carried home a feeling they couldn't shake, a sense of having touched something that operates by rules we don't understand? The legend presents us with possibilities, none of them entirely comfortable. Either the story is false, but then we must explain its persistence, its cross-cultural consistency, its anchoring to a specific site that demonstrably exists and demonstrably behaves strangely. Or the story is true, but then we must acknowledge that consensus reality has gaps, that time and consciousness can disconnect in ways that shouldn't be possible. Or, most unsettling of all, the story is both true and false simultaneously, existing in some quantum state where metaphor and literalism collapse into each other, where the symbolic and the physical occupy the same space. The cave still exists. The darkness there is the same darkness. Centuries have come and gone outside, empires risen and fallen, but inside, in the deepest chamber where 7 men supposedly lay down in fear and woke in bewilderment, time may not have moved at all. Or it may have moved differently, running on tracks parallel to our own but not synchronized with them. The stone remains. The silence waits. And somewhere in that waiting is an answer we don't yet have the framework to understand. A truth that requires a vocabulary we haven't invented. Perhaps someday we'll return to that cave with instruments sensitive enough to measure what's actually happening there, with theories sophisticated enough to explain the inexplicable. Or perhaps the mystery is the point, the reminder that reality is larger and stranger than our categories can contain. Perhaps some questions aren't meant to be answered, only witnessed and wondered at. But the most haunting thought is this: what if it's still happening? What if time in that cave moves so slowly that, to whatever consciousness exists there, only moments have passed since those 7 lay down to rest? What if they're still sleeping, still waiting, existing in a pocket of frozen time, while centuries accumulate outside like snowdrifts? And what if someone else, some modern pilgrim or lost hiker or curious fool, walks in and lies down and joins them in that timeless sleep, where 300 years pass as an afternoon nap? The cave still exists. It still waits. And time there, despite all our clocks and calendars and certainties, may not flow the way we assume it does. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.